Welcome to Chapter 2, Section 4, Deductive Reasoning. Deductive reasoning uses facts, rules, definitions, or properties to reach logical conclusions from given statements. Now, we are going to look at these conclusions and we're going to try and prove whether they are valid or not valid. Now, one counterexample is enough to disprove a conjecture that's reached using inductive reasoning. So another way to say that is one piece of proof is enough to prove something's false. But one piece of proof is not enough to prove something is true. Instead, we have certain laws that are going to help us do that. The first one we're going to talk about is called the law of detachment. And this law, using symbols, basically states that if you have an if-then statement, so if the statement, if P then Q is true, and you know that P is true, then that means Q also is true. Let me show you this with an example. Okay, here's an example of a problem, and all of this information, all of this is what will be given to you. So our if-then statement, what's given to us? If a car is out of gas, then it will not start. Joe's car is out of gas. The conclusion is that Joe's car will not start. And it's up to you to think of it and say, is that valid? Is it a valid conclusion or is it not? Well, Joe's car is out of gas. That is our if. The conclusion is our then. So, the hypothesis is satisfied, therefore the conclusion should be valid. So I would mark yes, this is a valid conclusion. And that's how you would answer that. Here's the next one. And again, all of this would be given to you as a question. If Joe goes to the beach, he will wear sunscreen. Joe is wearing sunscreen. So the conclusion is that Joe is at the beach. Now the question that you have to answer is this valid? Well, he's wearing sunscreen, so that satisfies the conclusion of the conditional. But does that statement satisfy the hypothesis? Well, not necessarily. He could be wearing sunscreen anywhere. Since the hypothesis is not satisfied, then we would say this is not a valid conclusion. And that's the difference. In the previous example, the hypothesis was satisfied, therefore coming up with the same conclusion as in the if-then statement is valid. Here, the hypothesis was not satisfied, so just assuming it is not okay. All right, so the next form of deductive reasoning we're going to talk about is the law of syllogism. Syllogisms, I think, are pretty interesting. Hopefully you like them. Basically, it's kind of like taking the next progression in logical thinking. So basically, if P then Q is true, and if Q then R, if these are both true statements, then if P then R is also a true statement. Now, that might sound confusing at first. I'm going to give you an easy example, and I think it'll make total sense to you. Okay, so, again, this is what you would get in a question. We have our two if-then statements. First, if you get a job, then you will earn money. Second, if you earn money, then you will buy a car. So the conclusion takes the hypothesis from the first and the conclusion for the second. If you get a job, then you will buy a car. And this is valid because it satisfies the rules. If this is true and this is true, then we can take the hypothesis from the first statement and the conclusion from the second and form a new if-then statement that is true. So this would be a valid conclusion. It's also important for you to keep in mind that the conclusion from the first statement has to be the hypothesis from the second. If that's not true, then you can't do this. You can't come up with that conclusion. Basically, these two have to be the same. And that is deductive reasoning. See you in class.